Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Recycled Content, a podcast of the Association of Plastic Recyclers, an international nonprofit and the largest North American organization focused exclusively on improving recycling for plastics. I'm Kara Pachiro, and I'll be your host today. In just the last 15 months, 7 U.S. PET recycling facilities have shut down, eliminating nearly 25% of domestic PET recycling capacity. Industry leaders say the closures aren't about inefficiency or lack of demand, but instead the result of a flood of low-priced imported plastic entering the U.S. market. This debate recently reached Washington, D.C., where APR President and CEO Steve Alexander testified before the Office of the United States Trade Representative, or USTR, as part of an ongoing Section 301 investigation into foreign oversupply and unfair trade practices. Today, Mr. Alexander is joining us once again to talk about his testimony, what's happening in the PET recycling market, why recyclers say they can't compete against artificially low-priced imports, and what's the truth behind those headlines claiming global events like the war in Iran are giving a boost to the recycled plastics industry. Welcome back, Steve, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Ms. Pachiro. Thank you for having me.
First, let's talk about why APR decided it was important that we testify before the USTR at this particular hearing. I mentioned this was part of an ongoing Section 301 investigation into foreign oversupply and unfair trade practices. Tell us more about this investigation.
I think, first of all, we need to understand, particularly in the environment today with a lot of tariff activity and discussion across the economy, it's pretty important that the U.S. government is now looking at 16 countries for illegal trade practices. And those practices have particularly hurt the plastics recycling industry. It helps to understand that this particular investigation comes at a very critical time for our industry. This activity is not just like yet another hearing on Capitol Hill. This is a targeted hearing in front of the International Trade Commissioners. The hearing is preceded by volumes of data that we provided to the Commission to take a look at the impact of unfair foreign competition, with our industry, the impact it's having on not just supply, but it's also having on jobs and plant closures. That's a very big deal. So this industry is at a critical stage. This is an industry that helps reduce plastic waste. It replaces the use of fossil fuels to a certain extent. It allows for us to reduce the use of energy, and it reduces carbon footprint and greenhouse gas emissions. This issue is one upon which really needs government focus and government policy in order to maintain the ability for it to serve the United States market.
Thanks for providing that background information, Steve. As part of your testimony, you talked about the U.S. PET recycling industry reaching a breaking point. What does this mean and what has brought us here?
Well, look, let's set the bar in terms of what I mean about that. So in the last 15 months, as you indicated earlier, we've had 7 U.S. PET recycling facilities simply shut down. Now, PET, of course, is say, water bottle resin, and it's the most iconic material to ever be recycled, probably along with an aluminum can. And it's been successfully recycled in programs now for over 40 years. So you have the most iconic plastic package that somehow the recycling facilities are either not getting enough material, but more importantly, they're not getting any buyers. Why aren't they getting buyers? Because these foreign countries, these 16 countries, are processing material is supported by the country and the state system, which allows them to underprice material here in the United States to the point where it's not cost competitive. And you don't know how this material is collected either from environmental regulations, labor laws, or things of that nature. And you don't know whether or not it's actually post-consumer material, which is the issue that we're trying to deal with. And so to put in perspective, those companies, those 7 companies represent about a little over 25% of the processing capacity in North America. Now, let's put that in perspective. That's essentially akin to Ford and GM shutting down operations in the United States. So it is a huge impact. And again, this is the most recognizable, iconic recycled plastic product. And it's all due to basically price. And the price difference is being subsidized by these foreign countries. And so in the world marketplace, the way countries have deal with that, as everybody knows right around now, is you take some sort of trade remedy. And in this particular case, the U.S. Trade Representative is investigating whether or not to apply a tariff to these countries on a wide range of products. It's not just about PET plastic. It's steel, it's aluminum, a lot of other products as well. It's not about the plants that we have, which are mostly very modern plants. It's not about a lack of efficiency. It's not about certainly a lack of material, but the fact of the matter is, and it's not necessarily about a lack of demand. It's the fact that the demand is there, but when you have a low priced alternative, I mean, an extremely low price alternative, relatively speaking, that floods the market, well, that's what happens when we end up eroding the market and the demand for, say, North American based material. So that's pretty much where we are at this juncture.
Let's add some context to those numbers. How significant is the loss of 7 PET recycling facilities in just 15 months, which we said equals about 25% of the domestic PET recycling capacity? So how significant is that loss?
Well, generally speaking, there's over 80 reclaimers across the United States that recycle what we call post-consumer plastics. And about 22 to 23 of those are PET recyclers. You're talking about almost a third of the PET recyclers I've shut down, representing 25% of the capacity. That's a significant volume of material. This isn't an issue that, well, they're dealing with for a while, but there are others in the marketplace that'll be able to pick up the slack or something along those lines. It's not like, oh, well, Ford and GM closed, so Toyota and Honda will pick up the slack. There's not going to be anybody else to pick up the slack here. And so, because again, it's about pricing, and we need to deal with the structural inequity of the system from a price perspective going forward. This is a very critical time. It's not just an industry complaining about foreign competition.
Let's talk about some of those countries that we mentioned, 16 that are being investigated. You stated that a number of those, which they have labeled significant exporter countries, are not simply competing, but flooding the U.S. market with rapidly increasing volumes at sharply declining prices. In the past, we exported plastic waste to Asia, but the national sword put a stop to that, and things have certainly changed. Which countries are driving the biggest surge in PET imports, and what evidence did APR present to the USTR showing unfair trade conditions?
Actually, the 16 countries represent a pretty broad swath of countries that's out there. And what's interesting is also the relationship between one of those countries, say, and other countries. You're talking about Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, obviously, India, China. And even if you're looking at a particular country within that spectrum, what you get a lot is what we call origin washing. So in order to avoid even tariff implementation, what some countries do is, they'll export the material to a country that is not necessarily subject to tariffs, and then they'll just flip a new label on it. Or what they'll do is they'll export material to another country, and that country will process the material. So it can be a very complicated issue. But I think the most important thing, until the national sword, the United States basically exported its plastic waste to other countries, and they dealt with that issue. Now what we have is essentially the United States is the recipient of plastic waste from these significant countries as well. So it's a sort of reverse role. So we need to support and build our plastics recycling industry. In this country, there's legislation and policies that incentivize the use of, say, renewable materials. And up until recently, we incentivize, say, the purchase of an electric vehicle, or we subsidize the creation of a nationwide infrastructure for charging stations for electric vehicles. Just this week alone, Congress is talking about tax incentives to recycle water. Well, those are the types of things that Congress and the government must deal with these issues in order to ensure we have a fair marketplace so that we can compete on a global scale. The dramatic increases in imported material really over the past several years from 2021. And then you couple that with steep price declines, and it's a perfect storm for the situation we're facing. India increased its exports to this country by 1,200% between 2022 and 2025. And yet their pricing fell by more than 60%. And then you take that from like Indonesia, it increased by more than 1,100% at the same period, and Thailand by more than 2,200%, and pricing reduction at about the same 40 to 60%. You see this, and then you couple that with the other issue, was overproduction of virgin material, which is depressed pricing in the virgin marketplace. China has built over 20 new PET processing facilities over the past 5 years. And it's way more than the Chinese marketplace can absorb. They're producing it and they're exporting it at below market prices to keep their manufacturing facilities running. But that is further depressing the virgin marketplace. The price of virgin goes down, which discourages brands from buying recycled material. And then, of course, the price of recyclate is going down from other countries because of state support activity. And again, you have a perfect storm that's impacting the North American plastics recycling marketplace. We're generating global oversupply and exerting downward pressure on prices worldwide, both from a virgin material and a recycled material. So that's why policy needs to be a very strong lever to help sustain this marketplace.
All of this information was included in your testimony. Of course, not to this level of detail, and that's why it's great to be able to talk about this on the podcast today. What type of action is APR urging the USTR to take?
Kara, we've taken a number of actions. The first thing we did was we asked, separate and distinct from this 301 investigation, we asked the U.S. Trade Representative to take a look at the import of recycled material vis-a-vis all PET material. However, there is not a separate, what we call HTS code, Harmonized Trade Standard code, for recycled material. Other countries have them. We don't. And so one of the questions that came back to us, well, how do we tell the difference between a recycled material and a virgin material? And the Trade Commission indicated that we really don't have the methodology to do that. So we again asked for a separate HTS code. That is in abeyance. That's still going on. And then concurrently, the administration came up with this Section 301. So obviously, it's an opportunity for us to use that. So we have a multi-pronged approach going on here. We sort of have three actions going on at once, but this is the one that's getting the most attention. And frankly, in the short term, it has the most impact in the marketplace. And then in the recycling industry, the plastics recycling industry, Canada, Mexico, and the United States, it's one market. Material flows back and forth across the borders from initial collection to initial processing to ultimately making the material and then sold. So one of the things we asked for in our testimony is to ensure that the current situation with Canada and Mexico remains sort of like one market. The other thing that we've done, just so you know, when it comes to this activity, we've worked with like the U.S. State Department, we've worked with the Department of Commerce, we've also worked for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in terms of other countries that are, say, not allowing certain products to be utilized to deliver goods. So we're always looking to do anything that we can to help expand the marketplace for material, even above and beyond the trade remedy activity that we have.
Obviously, these actions would make a big impact, and we hope that the USTR takes action. But that alone would not solve the challenges the PET recycling industry faces. APR recently published 2 reports, one detailing how record plastic production and imports are jeopardizing PET recycling, and then the other detailing how to fix the North American recycling industry. We've been talking about these challenges and what you would like the USTR to do, but what else needs to be done?
Well, wow, that's like my wish list, right? Every component of the supply chain has an impact on ultimate whether or not the package gets recycled. If a company is asking for a package or developing a new package, first of all, is that package designed to be recyclable? Number one, because ultimately, and APR has the design guide, which is recognized across the globe and it's translated into 4 languages as the ultimate design guide to design a package. So if you're not designing the package appropriately, it doesn't matter what happens. So, there are things that the recycler can handle, but there are things that are beyond our control. So certainly, in terms of a shared responsibility, you got to make sure the package is designed right. You got to make sure it can be collected, right? Then you got to be sure it can be sorted properly, and then we can process it. And then, of course, you have to have a market for it. And so you need to stabilize that system. And it's like it requires action across the value chain, right? From consumer brand companies and manufacturers and retailers and policymakers, et cetera. But, specifically, since you asked, I think there are some things that we would like to see. And this is a big list, okay? But first and foremost, as I indicated, we'd like the U.S. government to have a separate HTS code to track the import of recycled plastic. Recycled plastic is a different material from virgin resin. So that's certainly something that can be done at the federal government level. And then, obviously, actions like Section 301 and other trade remedies dealing with illegal practices from other countries. What do other government agencies can do? Like I indicated, we incentivize the use of solar and up until recently, electric vehicles and things like that. Well, what about tax credits and other financial incentives for the manufacture of recycled material and also the purchase of recycled material in your product? More specifically, you could have government required for mandated recycled content. In other words, you need to use recycled content in your package, and maybe you get a tax incentive for that. You know as well as anyone, APR has been calling for mandated recycled content for almost 20 years. We work on things like purchasing, giving priority to purchasing from North American resources, right? I think that would be extremely important. And how do you do that? How do procurement laws do that without violating World Trade Organization laws? I think the other things out there in terms of the plastics waste issue we deal with is primarily consumer waste. And so you need to make sure that you're dealing with post-consumer material that you and I use every day and discard. Bottles, yogurt tubs, laundry detergent, butter tubs, things like that. How do you do that? So, make sure you certify that when you say something's recycled plastic, it's from a post-consumer activity. And of course, APR has a certification program for that, which is actually hopefully going to be required in some state laws. The other thing that we would like to see that we've floated in law is, okay, well, if you don't buy from the North American marketplace, well, tell us where you get your material from. You have made in USA, and you have things that say product of China, product of Japan, whatever. Well, why don't you say made with material from Malaysia? And we think that would be a big step. Now, very controversial. We're not going to lie about it, but you asked, what would I like to do? And I think in that menu cafeteria plan I just laid out, there's a role for different organizations, the federal and state governments, the private industry in general, the producer responsibility organizations that are responsible for implementing these extended producer responsibility laws, which have these requirements, and environmental organizations, NGOs, state recycling officials. They can all play a role in this. People tend to say, well, the recycler can't solve these things. They can only recycle, A, what's designed to be recycled, and B, what's made available for them to recycle, because we don't collect the material. And then finally, we need to have a market. And so everybody needs to understand and work it overall that way, rather than just saying, the recyclers have to deal with that.
Right. Lots of different solutions, and everyone in the value chain plays a role. Like you said, we can't just rely on the recyclers to solve the issues of this entire packaging industry. You mentioned PCR certification as one of the solutions, and also the APR has had our certification program for about 4 years now, but it has largely been voluntary. What are we seeing now in terms of making certification a requirement?
Well, I just talked to you a little bit about how important PCR certification was, because it really, is the truth, in what is actually being in your product being called, with recycled content. And so right now with extended producer responsibility that's coming into play across the states, and then you have these recycling rate requirements and recycled content requirements. Well, you need to certify. How do you do that? And so one of the things we've been very fortunate to do with our advocacy program is you have states such as California, Oregon, Washington, and others looking at ensuring and referencing APR's PCR certificate program as a third-party certifier within that processes. And that's extremely important. You can't visually see if a plastic is recycled or it's a new plastic. The APR program is really a third-party standard to ensure companies are using content. California is the first one to require it, but there are others that are coming out. California law isn't perfect. We're still working on that. And we actually currently have a bill, Senate Bill 633, that it expands the PCR certification to all recycled plastic used in beverage bottles. And so other states have recycled content requirements, and we're going to be pushing them to include certification as a requirement. That's one of the things we do as an advocacy organization and how to do that. It's not just enough to say we use recycled material, but what is that material you're using? We don't consider plant scrap or post-industrial material because there's pretty strong markets for that, and that the consumer doesn't actually touch that. What we're trying to deal with, and what all this legislation is trying to deal with, is frankly the material that is out in the environment that is quote unquote plastic waste or is discarded by the consumer. That's where the issue is. And the only way to make sure you're dealing with that issue is certifying that the material is post-consumer material. APR's PCR certification is the gold standard.
Yes, it is. Recent headlines have claimed that the war in Iran could also be one of these solutions and that it's giving a boost to the plastic recycling industry. What are your thoughts on this?
I have very strong thoughts on that. I think that's an absurd thought process. War is not a long-term policy solution in this situation. There may be some little blip in the market for the short term, but as soon as the Strait of Hormuz is open again, we're going to go right back to the system. So that's an absurd way to look at this. And frankly, it's insulting to the industry. But this price disparity is going to come back once the Strait is open. But again, also remember, the price of oil is going up, so that's going to help recycle material. Yeah, but that impacts transportation costs. It impacts the cost for companies to access the material, bring them to market, getting recyclers, and more importantly, consumer brand companies to switch from using, say, virgin material to recycled material is not simply like turning the light on and off. There's a process that one has to do and change the specifications of your package. So, I think, unfortunately, that's a naive looking thing going forward. And then, of course, it's not like you have a contract that you can just shut off in a second. Most of these, most producers and major brand companies, they have contracts that go out months, if not years. And so it's simply a red herring, and it doesn't make any sense at all.
Agreed. We will add that one to the long list of misconceptions about our industry. Following the USTR hearing, what do you think is one of the biggest misconceptions policymakers and consumers have about recycled plastics or the plastic recycling industry in general?
Well, unfortunately, I think the biggest misconception out there is plastics recycling doesn't work. And unfortunately, the data that is used all the time, people use a very low percentage number for recycled plastic. But what we're really talking about here is plastics packaging. And plastics packaging only accounts for 40 to 45% of all plastic that's manufactured. And if you, in fact, take that material as the denominator, take that number as a denominator rather than, the 100% of plastic and use that as your comparison, plastics recycling numbers improve dramatically. Now, is it enough? Absolutely not. And so I think the other issue, of course, is there is not sort of a nationwide standardized infrastructure in terms of, do you have a recycling program? Do you have a curbside program? Do you have a drop-off program? Does it take the same things? You've heard me say this many times. There's like 15,000 recycling programs in this country. 9,000 take something different. So there are things that we can do that the recycler can't control that ultimately would help drive more recycling. And there's a lot of marketing out there which confuses the consumer. there's a credibility issue in terms of packaging. We're just trying to provide the credibility, but also we have, even given what we have right now with the PET market, there is capacity to recycle more material. So the frustrating thing is we can't recycle what is not made available to recycle. And so, we would like to see some activity relative to, not necessarily streamlined, but at a minimum, let's say if you're going to have a recycling program, at a minimum, you must take X, X, and X, water bottles, laundry detergent, milk jugs, yogurt tubs, or something like that, so that we can grow the system that way. We're ready to grow the system, but as we pointed out earlier, there's got to be some sort of shared responsibility. Fortunately, there's more attention focused on recycling the plastics in the last 5 or 6 years than there has been probably ever. And we're starting to see some laws come into effect. It's going to take a couple of years for them to have an impact. The regulations have to be implemented and tweaked out. Canada's got a lot of laws. Mexico just passed a new law that they'll be implementing. There's a lot of 7 countries in Latin America are now passing plastic recycling laws. Europe has a strong one. So you're starting to see that move, but we need to deal with these particular problems of not just overcapacity and overproduction of virgin material, but countries undermining the supply system and the pricing structure, say, in North America.
That is a great lead into my last question here. It's kind of a two-parter. So to wrap up today, you've talked about a lot of signs of progress. What do you think is one big sign of progress in the recycling industry that policymakers and consumers may not be seeing yet? And if the right policies and investments all come together, what could the U.S. PET recycling industry look like in, say, 5 years from now?
Plastic recycling, from a technology standpoint, is like the Silicon Valley of the waste management industry. The technological innovations in this industry, not just from the sorting and the processing, whatever, but from the packaging in and of itself, from the label technology, the cap technology, and the bottle technology, and what have you. Everything focused on capturing more material, making material more recyclable. So that's out there. And actually, the regulation requiring the use of more recycled material is really about where we need to go, because then people recognize this is something we have to do. It's not something we'd like to do, but it's something that we have to do. And that alone drives not just innovation, but it also drives potential market demand. You do not, if you think about even with the advent of AI or even from the automobile industry, like take the automotive industry. And, the automotive industry was incentivized to create and manufacture electric vehicles. They were given government money. Consumer was given tax incentives to purchase those automobiles. The tax incentives go away. So all of a sudden, there's no customer base. If you don't have a customer, then the companies stop manufacturing that material. So the policymakers, really, they need to what they're focusing on with extended producer responsibility and other types of legislation out there is they're essentially driving a customer base. Why would you be in business to do something if you don't have a customer? And plastic recyclers have been in that business for 45 years. And so we need customers. And so that's really where we need to focus as we go forward. And these policy levers finally are coming into place, which will help drive that customer base. And then we'll go from there.
Always like to end on a positive note, and agreed, there are lots of great things happening in plastic recycling, and I'm sure we will continue to see those grow even more. Thanks so much, Steve, for joining us today.
It's certainly a distinct honor and pleasure, Ms. Pachiro.
Great to hear. And thanks to everyone for listening. For more information about APR, plastic recycling, and much more, visit the APR website at plasticsrecycling.org. Check us out on LinkedIn, Facebook, and X at APR Recycles. And you can find recycled content wherever you get your podcasts. If you enjoyed today's episode, please be sure to subscribe, like, rate, and review.
This podcast was recorded in the studios of
Policy Resolution Group, Washington,